Boa tarde a todos. É um prazer estar com vocês novamente hoje. Nós tivemos as apresentações dos pitches de ontem, foram um sucesso, as pessoas mandando muitas perguntas, muitos comentários, nós estamos compartilhando, tanto com quem esteve nos painéis e nos debates, quanto com quem fez as apresentações. Em alguns casos, a gente vai ter que fazer uma sessão de respostas, de tanta pergunta que chegou aqui. E é uma pena que a gente não tenha tempo para responder todas diretamente. Eu vou passar a palavra diretamente para o professor Derk Loorbach, que está em Roterdã conosco hoje, tarde da noite. Eu só quero dizer que eu recebi a recomendação do nome dele e fui olhar um pouco do que ele faz, fui entender um pouco via YouTube as palestras e fiquei muito animado. E falei, precisamos convidá-lo para conhecer as pessoas aqui no GreenTech América Latina. Ele fala sobre Sustainable Transitions. E quando eu convidei, ele disse, não, eu vou falar sobre Radical Transitions. Derk, por favor, é um prazer tê-lo hoje conosco. Passo a palavra para você.
Yes, thank you, Tiago, and great to be here, and thanks for inviting me. That's good to hear how you found out about me. I think it's great to see how global and local the world is at the same time. So I will use my 30 minutes, to talk about radical transitions. Let's put it on full screen. And why I said not sustainable transitions, I hope to make that clear, because we have a lot of discussions in European, but also in the global context about sustainability maybe being part of the problem, and I'll make that clear. So I'm here basically in two roles. I'm a professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, a professor of socio-economic transitions, and the director of the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions. It's basically a social enterprise of the university where we combine academic research with consulting and training and education. I'm also academic lead for a new platform that was established at our university where we combine transitions research with design thinking and basically try to transform the university as a whole. The launch is in 2 days, so you can still join that also online. So now to transitions thinking. So it started already 20 years ago as a global or as a more European research network, but it's by now global. So there's also quite a number of transition researchers in Brazil, in Latin America, in South America. And the origin of the field is this basic question that most of you will recognize this figure. It's about the rising CO2 emissions. It's just an illustration of the kind of problems we are facing. This is not new knowledge. Obviously, in Rio in 1992, we already, the world already said we need to do something about climate change, biodiversity loss, and the concept of sustainable development was introduced. And since then, governments are talking about it, businesses is talking about it, civil society is talking about it. We all try to come up with sustainable solutions. But if you zoom out in the meantime, the problem has only gotten worse. So apparently there's something wrong with how we understand sustainable development, because clearly it's not working. And one of the core concepts in the transitions world, transitions research, that is the start of an explanation why it's so hard to transform, is this idea of a regime. So in societal sectors or in organizations, we over time develop a shared way of thinking, doing, and organizing, we say. So we invest in certain technologies, we develop certain organizational structures and routines, we develop regulation, we develop certain shared values and mindset. For example, in the energy system, it's typically based on big power plants, on fossil fuels, on a grid that connects consumers to the production. It's often developed in a liberalized market context. Or think of the mobility system, which is largely based on cars and on fossil fuels again, but on individual forms of mobility and building highways and bigger infrastructures. What we do as people, we develop these regimes as a way to structure society and to create stability and predictability. And all the time, we are busy trying to make these regimes better, or you could say less bad. So we try to innovate and optimize and make more efficient. This is a recent picture from the G20 leaders. This is a fountain in Italy. And for good luck, you throw a coin into it over your left shoulder or your right shoulder. It's a funny picture because it illustrates more or less that the political leadership and the way that we think about strategy in policy and business is basically creating this inertia and is not adequate for supporting transformative change for a number of reasons. They're listed on the left. What we see is that in strategy, in policy, in business, it's all about making plans. So we invest a lot in trying to think about what is the problem and what are the solutions and how are we going to implement the solutions. In the end, often not much happens, but we create the illusion that somewhere in the future, someone will actually implement all the ideas that we develop. There's also a fixation with risk. So we try to manage risk, we try to reduce risk, and try to stay in control, while if you zoom out, it's clear that we are not in control. And then when it comes to what we actually do, businesses, innovation, policy, it's all about coming up with new solutions. So we add new things to the problem. So we never stop doing things, we always add to what is already there. And one of the things that also became clear the last 2 years, especially with COVID, I talked to a lot of business people, a lot of policymakers. They clearly, and it's maybe a more general human problem, couldn't see such a major crisis or surprise happen. So it's a human condition that we expect tomorrow to be more or less the same as today, to have difficulty understanding exponential growth, for example. So if we talk about the future, the dominant paradigm is that we take the existing and try to improve it, make it less bad. But that is exactly the recipe for stagnation and stability. It's also the recipe that creates increasing crises, because as long as we keep optimizing something that's not sustainable, it becomes more and more problematic. Tell Volkswagen, for example. At a certain point, they started manipulating the data, but you cannot make a fossil fuel car zero emission. And the same goes for all sorts of other topics. We are increasingly optimizing economic systems that are vulnerable and at risk of transition. And COVID is a clear amplifier of those unsustainabilities and the vulnerabilities. So what we mean with a transition is basically a process where these regimes, these societal regimes, are pushed out of equilibrium. There's dozens of examples from the past where we moved from horses to cars, for example, or from coal to gas, or from extensive to industrial farming. So there's all sorts of historical examples of radical transformative system change. But one of the characteristics of it is that it's non-linear. And on the right, you see this model that we use. These societal systems are influenced by what's happening more broadly in society, technological change, sustainability concerns, demographic changes, but they're also influenced by emerging alternatives. We call them niches. You might say technological innovation, but what we explicitly also look at is social innovation. So changes in business models, in mindset, in lifestyles. So a transition, and this is summarized in this picture, is basically a process where structures and actors, organizations from within that regime try to improve things, make things better, but that becomes more and more difficult. And then we see a pattern emerging of destabilization and chaos, ultimately leading to phase out. On the other hand, and this takes a really long time, it can take decades for this chaos phase to arrive. On the other hand, we see these alternative experiments, entrepreneurs, change agents coming up with new ideas that at first are very alternative and maybe radical, but over time, more and more people join, the technology becomes cheaper, new market structures emerge, and that leads to a new future regime. So we hear about transitions now all the time. In Europe, we have the Green Deal. Also globally, the UN Secretary General is calling for transformative change. Big companies are talking about transition. But at the same time, when we look at what is actually happening, we can question whether this is not more of the same. Can we innovate our way out of it, or the existential problems we have, and can we achieve an economy that is nature positive through green growth? And there's a lot of evidence that says we need a different strategy. So this is what we call transition governance, basically adopting a different kind of governance mindset. If we assume and anticipate these future disruptions and shocks, what we need to do is maybe take an outside-in point of view. So don't only optimize from within the existing system or regime, but take a more long-term perspective, try to imagine future regimes that are really, truly sustainable, and then apply what we call backcasting. So try to think, okay, where is this alternative already emerging and how can we accelerate it? So this logic, and I'll now go very quickly because of time, but depending on where you are in a transition as an organization or as a sector, there are different ways on how you can translate these governance principles into action. So when a regime is very stable, it's about creating space for these niches. When more sense of urgency emerges within the regime, it's about creating connections. But more and more also in the European context, when we talk about electricity or mobility or finance or food, we are entering this phase where the stability that we historically developed is eroding quickly. So there's political pressure, there's inertia, there's instability, but there's also an emerging set of alternatives. And that requires a really more radical approach. And I know one of the topics at the conference is green finance. To apply, we also apply this transition logic to the finance transition. And what we see is that a lot of the discussions on finance, for example, are about how do we finance renewables or electric mobility, so alternative or green solutions. But in that approach, these economic transitions are still approached from the current finance regime, which is risk-based and trying to think about the cost and benefits of the investments. So part of the discussions we are having with our Dutch National Bank, but also in the finance sector, is that we need to also adopt a new type of mindset where we not only calculate finance risk, but which is also about integrated value. So green finance as financial transitions. So last 2 minutes, what we see more and more is that transitions are a big thing, but there are different types of transitions. So we can think about making the existing food system more sustainable. So we get a vegetarian burger at the McDonald's, or sustainable packaging, or we can think of truly sustainable practices that are also emerging worldwide, like regenerative food systems or more plant-based diets. The same is happening in the mobility system. So on the one hand, we see electrification. On the other hand, we see more and more cities thinking about design for people, and basically car-free cities or cities with only shared mobility systems. So one of the big projects I'm involved in now, I'm also a curator of the Architectural Biennale. It's sort of an international 2-yearly event. And what we're going to do is, what we're doing is bringing designers and transition researchers together to try to research, but also showcase the more radical transitions in food, in mobility, in energy. Radical in the sense that they go back to the community. They are about empowerment of local communities. They are about dematerialization, so using as little resources as possible and trying to create as much value as possible within communities based on renewables, but also cooperative models. It's about trying to, for example, think of ecological infrastructures, regenerative ways to produce food, but also these mobility transitions. So I've gone quite quickly from the abstract to the practical. What I hope is clear for my presentation is that talking about green tech and about sustainability and about transitions also implies that we start by rethinking the current regime and trying to ask a question, where are we optimizing something that is unsustainable, and where might we see a starting point or an emerging alternative that might lead us to a much more radical and desirable and accelerated systemic change in the near future. And I hope you join us in this quest for radical transitions. Thanks for listening.
Muito obrigado, professor Derk. Eu gostaria de... Nós estamos com o tempo estourado, então não vou poder abrir para perguntas. Mas eu gostaria de dizer para o público que, se tiverem perguntas, podem encaminhar para nós. Nós vamos repassar ao professor. E gostaria de agradecer muito a presença dele. Eu sei que o horário não favorece muito, mas foi excelente. E, professor, eu vou agora chamar o próximo painel. Não sei se você vai poder ficar conosco para assistir o painel de Green Finance, mas eu acho que o que você já comentou ajuda a abrir, e uma das coisas que nós vamos poder mostrar são novos modelos que estão surgindo por aí. Muito obrigado, agradeço novamente a tua presença.